The crisp Wisconsin air bit at Tom Miller's cheeks as he stepped onto the porch of his farmhouse. It was December 23rd, and a fresh blanket of snow covered the fields, transforming the landscape into a winter wonderland. At 63, Tom still appreciated the beauty of the season, even if the cold made his joints ache a little more these days. He was about to head back inside when a sharp bark caught his attention. Molly, their 8-year-old Labrador retriever, was standing at the edge of the property, her tail straight and ears perked. She let out another urgent bark, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Tom called out to Molly, questioning her unusual behavior. He squinted to see what had captured her attention. The old barn on the neighboring property stood silhouetted against the pale morning sky. It had been abandoned for years, ever since the Johnsons moved out and put the place up for sale. Molly barked again, more insistent this time. She took a few steps towards the barn, then looked back at Tom as if urging him to follow. It wasn't like her to make such a fuss, especially this early in the morning. Martha's voice drifted from inside the house, inquiring about the situation. Tom responded, expressing uncertainty and inviting her to investigate. Martha appeared in the doorway, wrapping a worn flannel robe tightly around herself. At 61, she was still as sharp as ever, her gray hair neatly tied back in a bun. She asked about Molly's barking target. Tom explained that Molly was fixated on the old Johnson place, pointing towards the barn. He emphasized that she wouldn't stop looking at it. As if to prove his point, Molly let out another series of barks, her whole body tense with urgency. She paced back and forth, her eyes never leaving the distant structure. Martha commented on the oddity of Molly's behavior, noting that she had never paid attention to the barn before. She suggested they might need to check it out. Tom hesitated, acknowledging Molly's unusual behavior, but expressing reluctance to trudge through the snow. He proposed giving her a minute, speculating that she might have spotted a rabbit. They watched as Molly continued her vigil, her barks growing more frantic. Martha disappeared inside for a moment, returning with Molly's favorite tennis ball. She called out to Molly, attempting to distract her with the toy. Normally, the sight of her beloved toy would send Molly bounding across the yard. But this time, she barely glanced at it before turning her attention back to the barn, whining softly. Tom remarked on Molly's atypical behavior, a note of concern creeping into his voice. He suggested they might need to take a closer look. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching in the fresh snow. Molly's tail wagged as she saw him approach, but she didn't move from her spot. As Tom drew closer, he could see the intensity in her brown eyes. Tom spoke softly to Molly, encouraging her to show him what had her so worked up. Molly took a few steps towards the barn, then looked back, making sure Tom was following. He trudged through the snow, grateful for the sturdy boots Martha had given him last Christmas. As he neared the fence line separating their property from the Johnson place, he paused, surveying the scene. The old barn loomed before him, its red paint faded and peeling. Snow had drifted against its walls, and icicles hung from the eaves. At first glance, everything seemed peaceful and undisturbed. But as Tom's eyes adjusted to the bright glare of sunlight on snow, he noticed something odd. There were footprints in the snow leading to the barn. Fresh ones. Tom's heart rate quickened. The Johnson place had been empty for years. Nobody should have been anywhere near that barn. He took a few steps closer, squinting to get a better look. The footprints were clear and distinct, leading directly to a side door of the barn. And there was something else. One of the second-story windows was broken, jagged shards of glass glinting in the morning sun. Tom was certain it hadn't been like that the last time he'd looked at the old place. Molly whined softly beside him, as if confirming his suspicions. Tom reached down to pat her head, murmuring words of praise and acknowledging that she was right to be worried. He turned back towards the house where Martha was still standing on the porch watching. Tom called out to her, requesting his phone and suggesting they might need to call the sheriff. Martha disappeared inside, returning moments later with Tom's cell phone. She hurried across the yard, her slippers leaving delicate imprints in the snow. She inquired about Tom's findings, slightly out of breath. Tom directed Martha's attention to the barn, pointing out the fresh footprints and the broken window. He emphasized that someone had been there recently. Martha's eyes widened as she took in the scene. She speculated about potential causes, wondering if it could be teenagers looking for a place to hang out. Tom acknowledged the possibility but expressed doubt, noting the unusual timing and weather conditions. He conveyed that something didn't feel right. He dialed the number for the sheriff's office, the cold air making his fingers clumsy on the touchscreen. After a few rings, Deputy Collins answered. Tom identified himself and explained the situation to Deputy Collins, describing the footprints and the broken window. The deputy listened attentively, asking a few clarifying questions. Deputy Collins responded, acknowledging Tom's report and explaining the current situation at the sheriff's office. He informed Tom that Sheriff Johnson was occupied with a multi-car pileup on the highway, and that they were short-staffed due to the approaching holidays. The deputy promised to inform the sheriff as soon as possible, and advised Tom not to approach the barn, citing potential dangers. Tom agreed to the deputy's instructions, though he couldn't help feeling a twinge of disappointment. He understood the limitations of the sheriff's department, especially during the holiday season, but the thought of someone possibly hiding out in the old barn made him uneasy. He relayed the conversation to Martha, who expressed frustration at the idea of waiting passively. She glanced nervously at the barn. Tom sighed, suggesting they return to the warmth of the house and keep watch from the kitchen window. They made their way back inside, Molly following reluctantly behind. Once in the kitchen, Tom poured coffee for both of them, and they settled at the table with a clear view of the old Johnson place. As the morning wore on, Tom found himself growing increasingly restless. He kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone emerge from the barn. But the property remained still and silent, the only movement coming from occasional gusts of wind stirring the snow. Molly was equally agitated. She paced back and forth between the kitchen and the front door, whining softly and casting longing looks outside. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an anxious energy that set Tom's nerves on edge. Tom expressed his unease to Martha, noting the lack of response from the sheriff's office and voicing concerns about potential dangers or someone in need of help. Martha reached across the table, placing her hand on his arm. She acknowledged their shared worry, but reminded Tom of Deputy Collins's instructions to avoid the barn, emphasizing the need to wait for professional intervention. Tom nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to do something. He was about to suggest calling the sheriff's office again when Molly suddenly let out a series of sharp barks. They rushed to the window. At first, Tom couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Someone was definitely inside the barn. He could see a shadow moving past one of the ground floor windows. Tom declared his intention to investigate closer, his jaw set with determination. Martha protested, citing potential dangers and urging Tom to wait for the sheriff. Tom was already pulling on his coat. He assured Martha that he wouldn't enter the barn, explaining his plan to gather more information for the sheriff. Martha looked torn, but she recognized the stubborn set of her husband's jaw. Knowing argument was futile, she reluctantly agreed to accompany him, insisting on bringing Molly for added safety. They bundled up against the cold and stepped out into the afternoon light. The sun was already beginning its early winter descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. Molly trotted ahead of them, her earlier excitement tempered by the seriousness of her human's demeanor. As they approached the old Johnson property, Tom felt a mix of apprehension and determination. He knew they were potentially putting themselves in harm's way, but the thought of someone in trouble, or someone up to no good, so close to their home, spurred him on. They paused at the fence line, surveying the scene. The barn stood silent and imposing, its weathered walls revealing no hints of the activity within. The broken window on the second floor gaped like a missing tooth, dark and ominous. Tom whispered their plan to circle around to the back of the barn, mentioning an old hay door that might allow them to peek inside unnoticed. Martha nodded, her gloved hand gripping Tom's arm tightly. They moved carefully through the snow, trying to stay low and out of sight of the windows. Molly padded silently beside them, her ears perked and alert. As they rounded the corner of the barn, Tom's foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow. He stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell. Curious, he brushed away the powdery layer of white to reveal a discarded candy wrapper. Tom showed the wrapper to Martha, noting its freshness and speculating on how recently it must have been dropped. Martha's brow furrowed with concern. She expressed her growing unease and suggested they reconsider their approach, proposing they return home to wait for the sheriff. But before Tom could respond, a muffled sound came from inside the barn. It was faint, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the bare trees, but unmistakable. Someone was crying. The sound of muffled crying froze Tom and Martha in their tracks. They exchanged a worried glance. The gravity of the situation, suddenly very real. Molly's ears perked up, her body tense as she stared intently at the barn wall. Tom motioned for Martha to stay close as they inched towards the source of the sound. The old hay door creaked slightly as Tom gently pushed it, revealing a sliver of the barn's dim interior. The musty scent of old wood and damp straw wafted out, mingling with the crisp winter air. Inside, shadows danced across piles of discarded farm equipment and moldering hay bales. The crying grew louder, punctuated by soft whimpers that echoed in the cavernous space. Tom's eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source. Suddenly, Molly let out a low whine, her nose pointing towards a far corner of the barn. There, partially hidden behind a rusted tractor, they saw movement. A small figure huddled on the ground, shoulders shaking with each sob. Tom's protective instincts kicked in. He pushed the door open wider, stepping inside with Martha close behind. Their footsteps crunched on the debris-strewn floor, alerting the figure to their presence. A young girl, no more than 16, looked up at them with wide, frightened eyes. Her face was streaked with tears, her clothes dirty and torn. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall. Martha's maternal instincts took over. She approached slowly, her voice soft and soothing as she assured the girl they meant no harm. Tom hung back, not wanting to overwhelm the clearly terrified teenager. As Martha drew closer, the girl's fear seemed to give way to exhaustion and relief. She burst into fresh tears, her body racked with sobs. Martha knelt beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. The girl flinched at first, but then leaned into Martha's touch, desperate for comfort. Through her tears, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Her name was Kate, she explained, and she had run away from home 3 days ago after a heated argument with her parents. She had wandered for hours, eventually stumbling upon the abandoned barn as night fell. With nowhere else to go, and temperatures dropping, she had broken the window to get inside. But as the days passed, hunger and cold had set in, and fear had paralyzed her. She was too ashamed to go home and too scared to seek help. Tom's heart ached for the young girl. He thought of his own grandchildren and how worried he would be if any of them were in Kate's situation. He pulled out his phone, ready to call for help, but paused when he saw the panic in Kate's eyes. Martha sensed the girl's fear and spoke gently, explaining that they needed to get her somewhere warm and safe. She promised Kate that they would help her contact her parents and work things out. After a moment's hesitation, Kate nodded, her resistance crumbling in the face of Martha's kindness. With great care, Tom and Martha helped Kate to her feet. The girl was weak from hunger and cold, her limbs stiff and uncooperative. They wrapped her in Tom's coat and slowly made their way out of the barn, Molly leading the way with her tail wagging gently. The walk back to the Miller's farmhouse seemed to take an eternity. Kate stumbled several times, leaning heavily on Martha for support. Tom kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, half expecting to see the sheriff's car pulling up at any moment. Once inside, they settled Kate on the living room couch, wrapping her in warm blankets. Martha bustled about, preparing hot soup and making a mug of sweet tea. Tom called the sheriff's office again, this time speaking directly to Sheriff Johnson, who had finally returned from the highway accident. The sheriff listened gravely to Tom's account, promising to send a deputy out immediately. He also said he would contact Kate's parents, who had reported her missing and had been frantic with worry. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Martha gently coaxed Kate to eat some soup. The warm food seemed to revive the girl a bit, bringing some color back to her pale cheeks. She began to open up more, explaining the trivial nature of the argument that had led to her rash decision to run away. Now, looking back, she realized how foolish and dangerous her actions had been. Tom and Martha listened without judgment, offering words of understanding and reassurance. They shared stories of their own youthful mistakes, helping Kate see that one bad decision didn't have to define her entire life. Molly, sensing the girl's distress, had positioned herself at Kate's feet, occasionally resting her head on the girl's lap. The simple presence of the dog seemed to have a calming effect, and Kate found herself absently stroking Molly's soft fur as she talked. The sound of a car pulling up outside alerted them to the arrival of the deputy. Kate tensed, but Martha squeezed her hand reassuringly. The deputy, a kind-faced woman named Officer Smith, entered the house and approached Kate with gentle professionalism. After a brief conversation with Kate and the Millers, Officer Smith confirmed that Kate's parents were on their way. The relief on Kate's face was palpable, though tinged with apprehension about facing her family after what she'd put them through. As they waited, Officer Smith praised Tom and Martha for their actions, emphasizing how differently things could have turned out if they hadn't investigated. She also gave Molly an appreciative pat, acknowledging the dog's role in the rescue. The arrival of Kate's parents was an emotional scene. Her mother burst through the door, tears streaming down her face as she enveloped her daughter in a tight embrace. Kate's father followed close behind, his stern expression crumbling into relief as he joined the hug. For a few moments, the room was filled with a mixture of sobs, apologies, and expressions of love and forgiveness. Tom and Martha stood back, giving the family space for their reunion, but feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at the part they had played in bringing it about. After the initial flood of emotions had subsided, Kate's parents turned to Tom and Martha, expressing their profound gratitude. They listened in awe as the Millers recounted the day's events, marveling at the series of circumstances that had led to their daughter's rescue. As the group prepared to leave, Kate to be checked out at the local hospital as a precaution, there were handshakes, hugs, and promises to stay in touch. Kate knelt down to give Molly a final pat, whispering her thanks to the dog who had first raised the alarm. With a final wave, the cars pulled away, leaving Tom and Martha standing on their porch in the fading afternoon light. The excitement of the day seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a profound sense of gratitude and reflection. They made their way back inside, the house feeling oddly quiet after the day's events. Molly trotted after them, her tail wagging contentedly as if she knew she had done a good job. In the kitchen, Tom and Martha found themselves going through the motions of their usual routine, but with a heightened awareness of how differently the day could have ended. As Martha began to pull out ingredients for their evening meal, the phone rang. It was their daughter, calling to confirm plans for Christmas dinner the next day. As Martha chatted, sharing an abridged version of the day's excitement, Tom found himself staring out the window at the old barn, now peaceful in the gathering dusk. He thought about Kate, about how close she had come to becoming another tragic statistic. He thought about the twist of fate that had led Molly to sense her presence and raise the alarm. And he thought about the importance of trusting one's instincts, of not ignoring signs that something might be amiss. As Martha hung up the phone, she turned to Tom with a soft smile. "Our Angela sends her love," she said. "Says she's proud of her old mom and dad for playing hero." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "We're no heroes," he replied. "We just did what anyone would do. If there's a hero in this house, it's this old girl right here." He reached down to ruffle Molly's ears. Martha nodded in agreement, her eyes misting slightly as she looked at their faithful companion. Without a word, they both knelt down beside Molly, enveloping her in a warm embrace. In that quiet moment, as the first stars began to twinkle outside and the scent of Christmas dinner preparations filled the air, they silently acknowledged the profound impact of Molly's actions. As they held their beloved dog, Tom and Martha felt a renewed appreciation for the simple blessings in their lives: their home, their family, and the loyal friend who had reminded them of the importance of paying attention to the world around them. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the events of the previous day feeling almost like a dream. As Tom and Martha began their Christmas preparations, the phone rang. It was the local hospital, calling to inform them that Kate was doing well and would be released to spend Christmas with her family. The news brought smiles to both their faces, adding an extra layer of joy to the holiday spirit that filled their home. As they went about their day, cooking and decorating for their family's arrival, they found themselves pausing occasionally to give Molly an extra pat or a special treat. When their children and grandchildren began to arrive, the story of Kate's rescue was told and retold, with Molly receiving a hero's welcome from the entire family. The old dog basked in the attention, her tail wagging happily as she accepted pets and praise from everyone. As they all gathered around the table for Christmas dinner, Tom stood to say grace. His voice was thick with emotion, as he gave thanks not only for the food and family before them, but for the reminder they'd received of the importance of compassion, trust, and community. The meal was filled with laughter, love, and a deeper appreciation for the bonds that tied them all together. And through it all, Molly lay contentedly at their feet, a silent guardian whose actions had brought about a Christmas miracle none of them would soon forget. As the evening wound down and the family began to depart, Tom and Martha found themselves once again on their porch, waving goodbye to their loved ones. The old barn stood silhouetted against the starry sky, no longer a source of mystery, but a reminder of the unexpected ways in which lives can intersect and be forever changed. With a contented sigh, they turned to head back inside, Molly at their heels. As they crossed the threshold into their warm, love-filled home, they exchanged a glance of deep understanding. This Christmas had brought them an unexpected gift, a renewed faith in the power of intuition, the importance of community, and the profound impact that even the smallest actions can have on the lives of others. And as they prepared for bed that night, with Molly curled up contentedly on her bed nearby, Tom and Martha knew that they would never again underestimate the wisdom and instincts of their four-legged friend. In her own way, Molly had not only saved a life but had also reminded them of the true spirit of the season, one of love, compassion, and the courage to act when others are in need. Molly's instincts saved the day on that cold and snowy Christmas Eve. Have you ever witnessed a pet doing something extraordinary like this? Share your story in the comments. If Molly's courage inspired you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories about animals who truly make a difference.